We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Last year, we also emphasized very much on the importance of having clearly defined directions, clearly defined and expressed as well. And so, as part of this, with the network, its leaders, and Justin Massie, the co-director, we decided to find partners to launch a series of consultations that would better define its strategic directions with the experts of the Strategic Analysis Network. And so this spring we set up a series of consultations, of roundtables, let's call them, held in Ottawa, Montreal, and Calgary. This was held with partners that you will find represented on the first panel here. The goal was really to put several questions on the table to really try to define this strategic vision, to propose some clear outlines for Canadian foreign and defense policies. Also, in parallel to this exercise, there was also an announcement of a defense policy update. So for us, this exercise became even more relevant. Consultations that we did resulted in a report that was shared. You have access to this report. You can also find it online. It is called By Design Rather Than By Default, or Design Over Default in English. In this report, we propose sort of a summary of consultations, of proposals that called for a greater consensus. But we also wanted the report to bring forth discussions, and that is what really is the point here this morning, because we asked them to react to this report, to proposals in the report. And if you have not had a chance to take part in the consultations, you also have the chance to give feedback, because this is a living document that can be adapted to events and reflections. You have seen that there are far fewer restrictions than last year in terms of the setup of the room, the number of guests. I mentioned this because the Strategic Analysis Network has a mandate to build links between researchers from different fields, from different regions in Canada. There are many international collaborations also. And we also have a large group of emerging researchers. So for the people in the room, I invite you to go and talk to our emerging researchers, to the students also present here. This is very important after 2.5 years of pandemic to foster these interactions. I also mentioned that the network is very much focused on the next generation, on this group of emerging researchers in the network. The network also depends very much on the expertise of its members, its professors. And for that, I wanted to highlight also the contribution of our leaders, Sarah Myriam, Martin Brûlé from Bishop, Theo McLaughlin from University of Montreal, and Jonathan Paquin from Laval University. And with them, we have ensured a very good continuity in the programming since the creation of the network, thanks to their workshops, their sustained participation in the annual colloquium. So I invite you to go and talk to them to learn more about the network. And finally, the network that you are now familiar with, yes, is a bilingual network. This is what sets it apart. You see online, our publications are available in both languages. We do have also interpreters present for the event today. You have received instructions by email to have access to translation. And then for our panelists and for the day's events, we really invite you to speak in the language of your choice. So that's important to mention it. I also want to thank in advance all of the AV team, our interpreters, Lambert Deslandes, Emile, Brian Hotman, who really have been at the core of this organization. So thank you very much for helping us and supporting us here. The venue is beautiful, the program is spectacular, and without further ado, let's get into the thick of the programming, I'm going to introduce the co-director of the network, Justin Massie, who will be talking about the research directions since the creation of the network, with a focus on publications that have been shared online in the last 2.5 years. Justin, the floor is yours. Thank you, Stéfanie. It's been about 2.5 years since the Strategic Analysis Network was created, thanks to the Department of National Defense Mines program, which we thank, and we also will mention that we will happily apply for a renewal for the next 3 years if they are listening. And Stéfanie mentioned that we wanted to work on creating bridges between the English and French communities in the country. We wanted to train the next generation of researchers and also mobilize knowledge that is too often behind paid scientific articles or inaccessible in books, and making more digestible for the general public and for the people in the Canadian government. And for that, I think we have been quite active over the last 2.5 years by organizing 31 scientific events, by publishing publications that have been put forward, whether it is in hotspots or whether it is on current events, policy notes with specific recommendations, or strategic notes where they go a little bit further in depth on the issues for the Canadian government. We have also worked on a lot of the 3 themes that guide our work: competition between great powers, which since last February 24th has taken on its full strength, its full importance through events, also cooperation in the area of defense, and also capacity building, the 3 main themes. We also have been fostering collaboration with international and national partners, whether it is RAM Europe, the European Security Studies Initiative, the Canadian government's CJUP, the NATO Syrium, a podcast also that's called the Security Council with the Syrium and the CGI and CDSM, with video clips also, and the Caisse de dépôt et placement, with which we collaborated. At the end of the afternoon, we will announce the Military Diplomacy Index, or the Military Deployment Index, that represents the military deployment of the different countries since the 90s. We have also created the Rubicon, an element that I am very proud to be associated with the IRSEM in Paris and University Paris 2, where we have created the equivalent of War on the Rocks, but in French it's called the Rubicon, and I invite you to read it. From this initiative online, we now also have a collection of books at the Les Équateurs publishing, the first 4 volumes, the 2 on the shock of the Ukraine war, the new forms of war, and 2 publications that will be available in the next few days also. If you'd like to get your hands on a copy, they're in front of the room also. And you can also consult the Strategic Analysis Network website to get a copy. So as you can see, we are very active. Another way we wanted to mobilize knowledge was by organizing these roundtables that Stéfanie mentioned earlier. And now, without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor over to you, Stéfanie, to really dig into this topic and look into what should be the strategic orientations in Canada, rather than by saying we should have some. Now we'd like to look into what they should be. Thank you. So here we are on this onto this first panel, emphasizing defense policy. As I mentioned, there is a defense policy update exercise. I'm sure most of you have heard about it. It is an exercise that is still ongoing, and I think today's discussions are not only presentations and exchanges, but I think we can have the ambition to really contribute in this process of update. And I think that's what we wanted to do also with this report that we also have sent to defense stakeholders Like just I mentioned, the Strategic Analysis Network is a collaborative network. So as such, this report was shared also with our panel members that took part in this during consultations and who helped organize and shape this report. As part of this report, what you find are proposals in relation to how is foreign policy and defense policy done. What frequency is it done? We propose in the report that it be done more regularly, like in other countries. It is a very inclusive and consultative exercise also, alongside Canadians. We have also proposed some clear regional directions. Canada is a medium-sized country, and even if it has global ambitions, it has limited capacity. The report asked a question with researchers and experts who participated in consultations. We're really asking the question, what should be the priority for Canada in today's world, knowing that there has been a shift in the international and security environment. And finally, we also asked ourselves about the role of the armed forces in Canada. So there was an increase in the requests made to the armed forces to participate in several operations in Canada. The pandemic is perhaps the example that is most accessible to everyone. So we thought about the role of the armed forces with this increase in demand at the national level and a bit of a more turbulent environment on the international level. We also asked questions about partnerships. If we think about the large international organizations, if we think about the network initiatives, the large summits, the more regional organizations, where should Canada be more involved? On the diplomatic side, on the military side as well, there are several military partnerships, capacity building activities. So we really thought about these partnerships. So to discuss the report, but also to have their idea on the topic, we have three renowned panelists. And Justin and I will be moderating this session. And we are also going to invite you to participate during the Q&A session. To start off, we have a few prepared questions for our panelists. I'll introduce them. I'll start with Kerry Beck, who until recently was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury Board, Economic Sector. Prior to that, she was our ambassador for 3 years. Ms. Beck is a career diplomat, and I invite you to read about her illustrious career and the program. She has been involved in priority issues for Canada, such as Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine, Syria, Mali, the earthquake in Haiti. She has supported the Prime Ministers of Foreign Affairs and virtually every major international summits, and also looked into issues of human rights, security issues, disarmament, terrorism, and humanitarian affairs. All to say that we have three main axes, and Kerry masters them all. Roland is a professor of international affairs and director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, who has provided much appreciated support during our consultation this spring. He is recognized for his expertise on international security, peace building, and foreign policy. This expertise has earned him a place on the board of directors of the Canadian Council, also in the position of foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister in 2015. So when it comes to developing strategies for Canada, Roland has always been at the forefront of this kind of deliberation, in addition to publishing excellent scientific articles. Jean-Christophe Boucher, third partner in this spring's consultation. Jean-Christophe is an associate professor in the School of Public Policy and the Department of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, is co-director of CANIS, the Canadian Network on Information and Security. That's another collaborative network, minds like RAS, and also director of research on civil-military relations at the Canadian Defense and Security Network, better known under its acronym in English, CDSN. I got your attention now. And Jean-Christophe is the author, along with Kim Richards-Nossel, of The Politics of War, Canada Mission, Afghanistan, 2014, with UC Press, an excellent book that I recommend to you. So Jean-Christophe and I, just to mention it quickly, we met at the PhD level during a conference exactly like this one. It involved our thesis directors at a time. And I hope that our emerging researchers here present will have the opportunity to create strong links, also bonds, also during such an event. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'm going to start with you, Jean-Christophe, my good friend from the doctorate level. And I'd like to ask him a bit of what he thinks of the report. General reflections on the strategic directions of Canada. We had this discussions in Calgary, but I also had the opportunity, you had the opportunity to read the report for the first time, and let's say it's the draft report and then an updated version that you can read online. So I'll leave it over to you, Jean-Christophe. Tell us what you thought of the report, and you can also open it up to a larger perspective on strategic directions for Canada. 5 minutes? 2? Okay.
So I'll do this in English because being in Calgary, it helps, and it warrants the use of translations. So reading the report, I was kind of trying to go into the mindset of like, what does it try to do? And in some respect, it tries to kind of take note of the 2017 strong, secure, and engage and move forward in some ways, like what has changed and what were the gaps or the things that we know now that we wish we knew in 2017. And also maybe kind of address the most difficult part of, I think, the recommendations. And I think the most difficult part, which is I find the most interesting and at least likely to see in the Defense Policy Review, is the questions around transparency and trust. And I think here, like everyone I would expect at D&D would avoid talking about this and putting this in an official document. But I think it's a capital and necessary step for CAF and D&D to put forward. And I have different kinds of reasons for why I think this is important, and hopefully this will eventually come to there. In some respect, I think the last 5-7 years really showed how on the national defense issues, there's some sort, not a crisis, but tensions in the civil-military relations in Canada. We have seen, on numerous issues from sexual misconducts, from international operations, from information influence operations, where the relationship between Canadians and CAF and D&D has been strained and difficult to do. And in some respect, we don't spend enough time thinking about what should be the civil-military relations in Canada and really try to couch this in interesting terms. And in some respect, and maybe this is going to please people from D&D, I feel that the burden is on policymakers more so than at colleagues and friends at National Defense. I feel that policymakers are actually the weakest link in that relationship. And somehow I would hope that a policy review would actually address this issue at the forefront. And I have like 5 arguments, and I'll do them super fast. The first one, transparency. It's the notion about values. What should be the values that shapes our national defense, and how to anchor our national defense policy into Canadian values? I think any document have to start from the assumption that the Canadian Armed Forces and our defense policy should be shaped around broader societal values. And when there's a significant gap between what the institutions represent in terms of values and what the society thinks that those values are, then there's a breach of trust and tensions between the civil-military relations. I think here the sexual misconduct is a good example of this. Where principles of inclusion, diversity, and equity. Within the Canadian society, there's broad expectations that our institutions will move forward on those issues of inclusivity, diversity, and equity. And somehow when institutions don't deliver or you show that there's significant problems, then there's a lack of trust and that erodes this trust. So transparency in terms of values. What are our values? What do we expect these institutions to be? And that should sort of frame a little bit the conversation we have. In what respect the Canadian Armed Forces and D&D reflects Canadian values? I don't think people think about these issues often, and this is how you end up in trouble really fast. The second argument is about trust. Essentially, more and more, we ask Canadians to sacrifice resources and money in the face of adversity. And the only way we can do this, and the way national defense can actually do this, is to have the trust of the citizenry. And in some respect, right now, there's an erosion of trust in institutions. We have political parties, we have domestic groups, we have international groups that are trying to erode this trust in an institution, which makes delivering defense policy effects or more and more difficult. By being more transparent and engaging honestly with the Canadian society, you can actually increase that trust. And I think here national defense has to do the work and increase that relationship. Thirdly, Stéfanie talked about the policy review. Part of that transparency is about thinking always about national defense and how to do this in real time. Policy reviews are never, ever a done document. They should be a living process. Every mature international partners have those policy reviews. We should have those in Canada. It's outrageous that we still don't have a foreign policy document. And I think here there's a big problem. Fourthly, transparency around recruitment. The armed forces are trying to recruit new people, a diversity of people. We're trying to expand the complements of CAF members. And without that transparency, without that trust, you'll not be able to recruit people in urban areas and a diverse culture. And there's a lot of work to be done in this issue. And the last one is maybe my soapbox, is like the information environment now has evolved in such a way that national defense has been flat-footed in the last couple of years, and to be honest, most Western societies. My sense is that the information environment is moving so fast now that there's no way to deal and engage with society in a way that is top-down and not in a way that is reactive. National defense, especially on information, has been reactive on all sorts of issues, which created all sorts of opportunities for mis and disinformation to spread in Canada, all sorts of opportunities for domestic and foreign actors to exploit those lack of information. And this is going to be a problem continuing forward. We know now that especially in modern warfare, information now is an integral part of any soldier's job. And I think this is going to go forward. And in most ways, I think national defense is not ready to have this conversation and needs to kind of put this. So all of those, this is why I would hope that transparency would be part of the document. But that would be the hardest sell, I think, for anyone there.
You're right. That was very succinct, very clear. Thank you so much. I will turn next to Roland Paris.
Yes, thank you. I would like to congratulate the authors of the report and the network for producing that document. It is a crystal clear analysis. It is very useful. And I would like, secondly, to make another comment on this proposal. This is a call for regular reviews of defense policies. I do support this proposal with a few caveats, as you can see. This is a good idea. It's a good idea because it is very hard to clarify or make strategic decisions without regularly thinking about the context, our priorities. However, the implementation of this proposal is a problem partly because of our political culture. In Denmark, for example, there is a political consensus on the importance of having every 5 years a review, and that is not the case in Canada, where there is a very old tradition of political party to use military and defense as a political tool, and we do not have independent parliamentary committee like the American Senate that would require a new document to be prepared every 5 years. Regardless of these challenges, we still need an ongoing reflection on defense policies and foreign policy. If we could get to a general consensus, at least on these principles, I think that would be progress. However, on Indo-Pacific, I'm not in such agreement with the report. I do appreciate that the report is trying to identify priorities. We cannot do everything like it says in the report. Indo-Pacific is becoming the center of geopolitical, military, and economic competition, and I don't see how Canada can stay on the sidelines. The report, and I quote, says that the Canadian involvement in the region does not require an increase in its military presence. Canada currently increases its defense engagement. We have advanced naval exercises in the area. As you know, Tuesday, 2 days ago, a Canadian frigate crossed the Taiwan Straits, and our Marine participates in exercises with regional partners and with allies. It is true that our naval resources are limited, but there will be more ships, I do believe, in the future, and I expect that several of them dedicate their time in that area. To me, that is a necessary part of the Canadian engagement in that region, in the Indo-Pacific region, and we'll see if the current government introduces this year, maybe in November, a strategy dedicated to that region. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Roland. A much awaited strategy in the Indo-Pacific. Kerry. Yes, thank you. Even though I do not live in Calgary, I am from here, and I will speak English because I am an English speaker and I'm more comfortable in doing so. So if you allow me. But don't hesitate if you have questions in French.
So unsurprisingly, I will also focus on the two areas that Roland focused on. I was a practitioner, so I'll take a slightly different approach to it, perhaps. The paper is very good. And as I was reading, I found that I agreed with 100% of the observations in it. Congratulations for such an effort. As Roland mentioned, a very rigorous work. I don't agree entirely with the direction of a couple of the recommendations. And so in my reaction to it, I'll explain why. So I'll focus on those two areas of a cyclical integrated review, foreign policy defense review, and then the idea that NORAD, NATO, and North American defense should be the backbone of our defense policy and our foreign policy. First, on the cyclical reviews. Well, as the paper says, it's been 17, almost 18 years since our last foreign policy review, and the last national security review was in 2004. Our Arctic policy is outdated, ainsi de suite. So I think it's time. But what do these reviews do? In the past, there was a proposal that we have an annual conference to review our foreign policy interests and revisit papers. So a living document similar to what you proposed. That happened once and then faded away. It didn't happen again. There was no positive decision not to do it. It just didn't happen. We don't have a history of white papers like many of our allies do. So I'm less outraged or perhaps less surprised that we don't have that kind of written document. But I think the time is ripe for a much more concerted approach, integrated review. And that's for two reasons. First, a transactional reason, and then a big picture reason. On the transactional front, previous foreign policy reviews haven't changed much. They haven't changed much in how we do foreign policy. Previous defense reviews, particularly strong, secure, and engaged, also haven't changed much in terms of our focus, but at least strong, secure, and engaged did change much in terms of government commitments to devote a certain level of resources to certain areas of focus. So we have a mixed history. So maybe they'll do nothing this time around, but I actually think they'll do something, as I said. So first, transactional reasons. They increase transparency and they increase constituency. Recent polls, a number of them have shown that Canadians are quite interested in Canada doing more and being more internationally. Canadians increasingly understand that every threat they see at home has its origins or its impacts outside of Canada. So there's an appetite there, and I think there's a political base there that could be built on to improve Canadians' understanding of international issues and Canada's place in the world. But it's not just about that. It also, inside the government, having lived through policy reviews on a number of issues, it forces inside government people to up their game. It increases their understanding. It increases their security literacy. In today's world, it would require domestic departments to engage more and understand the security implications of the civilian things they're doing, and vice versa. So ideally, there's a forcing function that requires government, inside government, to up their game. And not only the federal government, we need to do a better job of bringing the provinces and the municipalities. Because when we talk later about securities and threats, you'll see there is no one threat inside Canada that has a purely military response or is a purely security issue. And there's no there are a number of civilian tools that we have to deploy to respond inside Canada and outside Canada to respond to security threats. So there's a forcing function inside government, and then internationally it lets other nations know what we care about and what we worry about. And that's not a bad thing. It's a helpful thing. So for all of those reasons, I think that an integrated review is a very, very good idea. And those are transactional reasons. Now, let me just turn briefly to the bigger picture and why the bigger picture and the significant changes in the world also lead to a conclusion that we need an integrated review. This is trite for practitioners of international relations. We're in a world of flux. We're in a world of strategic surprise. There's no one global anchor. But for those of us who practice diplomacy inside negotiations, international negotiations across all of the multilateral fora, I'll tell you what I saw over that period. There was a period post-dissolution of the former Soviet Union where it was a world of possibility. We were out there negotiating new norms, new standards, and forging new partnerships. New norms in the areas, not just human security, landmines, violence against women, protection of children in armed conflicts, deepening the norms on arms control, etc. But doing that with cross-regional groups and doing it, except for landmines, but doing it mostly within the confines of those multilateral bodies where we had rules, procedures, and tables already built for us, right? Today, with fraying of those norms and fraying of US global leadership, appearance of more demands from the global South, more power from the global South, and a more aggressive China, you've got what I call messy multilateralism. A world where maybe there's a lot of possibility, but many of those rules and practices are much more fluid and much less reliable. So what do you need to do in that kind of world? You need to be able to focus. And when you focus, you need to be able to identify who those partners are around the world, who those partner states are around the world, who can help you move forward on those areas of focus. So in that world of flux and strategic surprise, I think it's even more important that we have a framework for our foreign policy and a framework for our defense policy. Otherwise, we're followers and we're reactive. So it's a dangerous world to be in. I won't get too deep into the other part of it, but just to say, because there's no one global anchor for stability, because we're required to diversify our partnerships, because it's in our interest to enhance our leverage and fortify the rules-based international order and those multilateral, plurilateral arrangements that give Canada more leverage. And because the threats at home are always going to have global roots and global impacts, I think it's not possible for us to say that, yes, I think it's possible for us to say, yes, we focus on North American defense, NORAD, NATO, and that part of the world as, you know, very important part of our foreign policy, but it's not possible to say that we will therefore be much less engaged militarily in Indo-Pacific or even in other regions of the world. I don't think that's possible because our military engagement is also a tool of diplomacy. It helps us gain that leverage when we do things for countries that then know they can count on us and they'll do us a solid when we need it. Mali, France, EU, one example. I could give you 15. So maybe in the conversation, we can delve further into what we do about that in a world of limited resources. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you for taking time to read our report, for commenting, criticizing, acknowledging it. That is the purpose of this type of meeting, of consultation. We can explore all this. I do understand the need for strategic consultations. Obviously, we need it. I would like to go a bit further in my next question. If we look at the large challenges, there are many ones. The return of Trump, maybe in a few years, the polarization of the American society like never before, major war in Europe, also reactive Russia, whatever happens to Vladimir Putin in the next few weeks, tensions around Taiwan and Asia, climate crisis, famine, drought, climate refugees around the planet. Tangibly, with all these challenges, what would be priorities where Canada should be committed to materially, and with what type of strategic action can we hope that Canada invests in leadership and mobilizes and engages its credibility? What should be prioritized and what should be done tangibly to address these challenges? Starting with you, Jean-Christophe.
I was hoping to have like at least 10 minutes to kind of think about this one. All right. So this is a big question. I think in some respect, the priorities right now, national defense is not prepared right now to deal with a slew of new issues that are facing up. I think in terms of information domain, we're completely not ready. And I think a document should focus on this. And I think we are building that capacity, but there's still a lot of reticence and fragility within D&D on putting this forward. So I think that's a priority. We should do this. The second part is, I like the argument that we should choose to do certain kinds of things and choose not to do other things. But one of the things we should try to do, and I think here I kind of join Kerry on this, is we should try to be useful to our allies in ways that it fits their needs. So in terms of helping them, A clear, for example, a clear priority should be logistic issues. Logistics. That's what wins wars, and the Russians are finding out this is what makes you lose wars. And I think here our partners always want us to do more on logistics. The Mali mission is a good example. We've helped them a lot with our C-17s to, move equipment in and out of Mali, and that was a clear capability that the French really considered useful for them. In fact, the French are always asking us to increase the numbers of hours we should fly to C-17, and they would be ecstatic if we could put more. And here, I think, we should, build more logistic capacities and deliver that capability to partners. We should have an outsized, fleet of C-17s. And when partners say, what can you bring? We say, like, we can bring C-17s hours, and people will like this. In some respect, I always say, in some ways, most of our partners are over-equipped compared to us. And in some ways, trying to do the same thing that they're doing is pointless. You don't go to a Scotch party and bring a subpar Scotch bottle. Everybody has a better bottle than you do, and everybody knows that you're bringing a $20 bottle of Scotch. What you should do is bring ice. Then if everybody brings Scotch and you bring ice, you're actually the person who brings the useful thing to the Scotch. Although I know there's a debate on whether or not you put ice in Scotch or not. So I think here we have to kind of decide what those capabilities and what we can bring to the table to our partners and do this. Here, I think logistic capabilities would be very much something that all our partners would say, like, we know the Canadians can help us in those kinds of things, and we should really do that. So concrete, buy more C-17s and lend them a lot.
On the regional landscape, priorities are quite clear. First, the continent, including the Arctic. Secondly, our closest allies are based in Europe, and we need leadership. Canadians felt quite isolated during the Trump years, and we should not waste those current relations we have. Thirdly, as I mentioned, the Indo-Pacific region. I don't think it is it is a very tough decision to identify these three areas. Now, in terms of tools, that is more difficult. Now I'll switch over to English.
We have for a very long time had the debate in this country about whether to specialize in certain kinds of capabilities. We can't, have, a world-beating submarine capability and a world-beating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the problem. The problem is that we just don't know which capabilities are really going to be important in the future. Did we really expect a tank war in Europe? When at a time when everybody was saying, no, it's all kind of gray conflict and soft capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, we will always be contributors to multinational operations. And in that sense, we don't necessarily have to have, elaborate, I don't know why I'm picking on submarines, submarine capability. But we do need to be multi-purpose, and that's expensive. And that expense is an insurance policy against a much more dangerous world. Now, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, if I talked about defense spending as an insurance policy, some people would roll their eyes. I think that the insurance is already paying out. And the absence of investment in some areas is already hurting us. So what more do we need than what we're already seeing? Would it take a Chinese attack on Taiwan for us to really wake up to the fact that this is a much more dangerous world and that we need to be prepared to engage in this world with capabilities so that we have a place at the table, so that we're credible. And let me just end with this comment, echoing something that Kerry said about military diplomacy. Canada's right now, even before this, the Indo-Pacific strategy should be released, Canada's already identified additional goals in the region, including trying very hard to get a seat at a number of tables. And those include security tables. So, you know, you need to pay to play. And we want a seat at those tables because that region is going to be so important to us. We are a Pacific country too, and to our economy and to our closest allies. So no, we're never going to have a budget that's even in proportion, a military budget, even in proportional terms like the Americans, but we need to face the scale of the risks that we are heading into. Kerry.
This is a huge question, and I honestly, I don't know which part of it to even start to answer, but for me, as I said earlier, I don't think it's a question of choosing a binary choice between choosing one region to focus on and saying, okay, well, we'll do less in another region. I don't think it's a binary choice. I think where we start the analysis is asking, what do we need to protect ourselves, right? But you don't stop the analysis there. So to answer that question, you have to look at the threats in Canada. Well, what are they? And I'll talk about the national security threats. Is it territorial? Not so much. It might become so in the Arctic with melting sea ice and increased competition. Maybe if there's a huge migrant influx on our border with the US, but it's not really territorial. Is it around democracy and social cohesion, disinformation, health security risks? Yes, but most of the answers to that are in the civilian domain with a tiny bit on the military front, right? Back to territory, in a way you could call cyber attacks as a, an attack on territory. Again, where does the answer lie? Primarily civilian with a bit military. And then on economic security threats, supply chains, markets have been slowing globally, energy 8 times, et cetera. Some of those economic issues can morph into security issues. So what do we draw from that? At Arctic in a second, we draw from that none of those security threats, we have to follow the fault lines. The impacts and the sources are quite often outside. So we can't have an answer that just focuses on North American defense. We have to look outward. And 2, it's always a mix of civilian and military tools. Arctic, I mentioned that at the beginning. So what kind of tools do we need for Arctic? Maybe it is subs. It's certainly enhanced surveillance, right? But a lot of that will be civilian, enhanced connectivity in the north, that kind of thing. It's certainly maritime. We don't have the maritime assets or the helicopters and that kind of thing yet. AOPS aren't fully operational in full Arctic sea ice. We've got polar icebreakers coming online in the next 10 years as a Coast Guard asset. But, what would we do in our northern waters? Do we have the maritime assets in place? Do we have the surveillance assets in place? Do we have the air assets in place? And what would land look like in that area? We need to unpack those very, very quickly if we're looking at, passable sea ice in the next less than 10 years, honestly. And then once we unpack what we need for that defense, identify what of those skills we would bring to allies and would serve our interests abroad. Is it heavy lift? I don't know. I mean, I talked about the 90s, that era of massive military operations around interventions. Afghanistan was the last one. I think we all learned that the peace dividends from those massive military engagements, we don't get the peace dividends we expected. I don't think we're going to see much of that. But you do need some heavy lift, right, for humanitarian assistance and for smaller missions like Mali. So maybe that's what we keep doing, or at least till, our planes stop functioning. Maybe that's it. Maybe we bring those skills. bring what we're good at. What are we good at? We're good at defense capacity building and training. We saw that in Ukraine. We're good at command. That's what we bring to UN peacekeeping operations. And Latvia. Yeah, we're good at command. What we need to be better at, cyber, intel, space. Actually, we're pretty good at space. I put that in my second category, things we're good at, space. We're actually quite a leader internationally. So build on those and say, okay, where can we bring those, it's like dual use, those capacities to bear on the international challenges that will help our allies. So don't do it outside in, do it inside out, but understand that outside matters as much for our own national security interests. So that's where I take it. But again, I don't have a precise answer for you, Justin. Excuse me.
No, it was very precise. Thank you for sharing these thoughts.
I would now like to open it up to a Q&A period. If you'd like to ask a question.
If you want to ask a question in English or en français to our fellow panelists, you are welcome to raise your hand and I will entertain a question. If not, I will continue with my hard questions to our panelists. Is there anyone in the room that would like to ask a question? Okay, here's my second tough question then for you. I mentioned in my...
I mentioned at the beginning, during my first question, that one of my biggest concerns is what happens to our neighbor in the South with polarization, with Trumpism that goes beyond simply Donald Trump, that will also perseveres and continue regardless of the midterm elections. How can Canada protect itself from these types of events in the US? Is there something to do, or can we simply hope for the best? Jean-Christophe.
Great question. So I think on the first hand, I think we need to, and I think here I kind of join Roland, we have to invest in our own capabilities and not expect our allies to do the things that we think they're going to do. I think NORAD modernization is a good example of this. We were expecting the Americans to do a lot of it. Now I think we're expecting like, no, we'll have to do it ourselves. And I think greater autonomy on our end actually increases our relationship with the Americans, because now we can say no when we don't think it fits our interests, and we can say yes when we think it fits an interest, because we have the capabilities to say no or yes. So I think here, essentially, defense against help, somehow it makes more sense with a mercurial ally that you actually don't know what the time span looks like. So that's the first part. The second part is, I think we don't have yet the conversation that much of our vulnerabilities in the cognitive space and the information space comes from the Americans. We always try to expect the Russians and the Chinese to be our closest kind of adversary. But when you look at, networks, information ecosystem, it's the American ecosystems that are actually infecting Canada. And I don't know what to do with this. First, recognizing the problem would be the good way. Like, far-right groups in the US are influencing our right of the spectrum, political domestic groups here, and that's an issue. And there's considerable leakage from the Americans to us. And on the far left, we have the same thing. And at least recognizing that our vulnerability comes from the US is the first step. And then what do we do? How do we, US proof ourselves from their craziness? And I don't know how to do that, but I think we should start to have this conversation.
Merci. Roland?
I'll just focus on one thing, which is the question of how to, you said in your question, should we espérer?
How should we hope for the best? Maybe JC can bring scotch with or without ice, and we can hope for the best.
I think, to be serious, that part of the challenge is how we protect ourselves, but part of it is how we engage in the United States in order to try to mitigate some of the risks to Canada that will inevitably arise. I say will because, as we all know, the Biden administration is certainly more friendly to Canada and less unpredictable than the Trump administration was, but it's a kind of kinder, gentler version of America First, particularly on trade issues. And so our economic interests are more exposed now than they have been before, as you all know, with the whole debate and discussion about electric vehicles, which fortunately was resolved for now. There'll be something else. And the other reason why this is going to continue to be a matter of urgency for Canada is that Trumpism isn't gone. And even if Trump himself ends up in jail or somewhere else and not in US politics, and there's no sign of any diminution of his support among his followers. There's an article in today's New York Times that's basically saying, there's no indication of any change in support for Trump among his followers. And so we're likely to experience some versions of Trumpism, even if they're aftershocks of the real thing. And, the last big period of similar kind of populism in the United States was Andrew Jackson in the 19th century. And even after he left the White House, Jacksonianism continued for a long time. So we're in for a bumpy ride for some time, and maybe for the indefinite future. And all of that suggests that Canada needs to continue doing what's already been doing during the Trump years, which is to expand its contacts at all levels of the US political system, not just in Washington, not just with the administration, of course with Congress, but at the state and local level as well, with key non-state actors, business interests, labor interests, the media, the ideas, environment, and we need to be simply the very best country in the world at managing within the U.S. system, because our interests are more exposed than any other country in the world. We're pretty good. And when we ramped up during the initial Trump period and during the renegotiation of NAFTA, there was a great coordination on the Canadian side and outreach, and it was really very effective. But that was an emergency, and it's hard to sustain kind of emergency level engagement. So the challenge now is to kind of get to a steady state where we have a higher level on a continuous basis of that kind of full court interactions in order to identify problems when they're emerging before they've really materialized, and to head them off, or to deal with real emergencies, whether it's somebody blocking the export of medical masks to Canada during a pandemic, or threats to our critically important auto sector.
I met President Trump. It was something. That scotch would be required for me to reveal, but anyway, it wasn't me alone, obviously, small fish, big pond, but there you go. President Trump is a symptom, not a cause. So, even if things happen with the New York Attorney General or the January 6th committee or what have you, I think that populist streak is here to stay for at least a while. What should we worry about? We worry about that populist streak and so a fraying of social cohesion. We worry about them exporting their extremism to us, but we shouldn't be too proud or smug about ourselves, because a lot of the actors January 6th were actually Canadian exports too. So we're not just America light on the right-wing extremism front. We have our own issues, our own homegrown issues, not just imported. So we worry about that. We need to worry about, on the international level, US isolationism. Just as with populism, there have been cycles of US isolationism over the years. We've managed through them, but we have to be prepared. We have to worry about how much will they protect Canada. in the event of something hitting the fan. In the Arctic, we have a contested maritime boundary, right? In the air, if threats are coming over our northern airspace into the US, how much will they protect us? We have to worry about those things. What should government do? I agree, we cannot disentangle ourselves. We can't US proof ourselves. We can't disentangle ourselves because of our economy, our geography, our history. We have to become the best at managing the US. But to quote Pearson right after the Second World War, he said, this is around the time NATO was being formed. He said, while during the Second World War, Canada had to follow the lead of the UK and the US, it was necessary. It's inconceivable in this post-war world where we're building this international architecture that we would not have our own voice and presence in the international stage. I'm paraphrasing. So I think it's time for us to start to carve out some space for ourselves. We've done it. We did it in Iraq. We've done it throughout, but a little more visibly. And that's the attraction of written down foreign policy review, defense policy review. I also think from the government, we will not and should not see messaging from government leaders about worrying about a civil war in the US or about a rise of populism necessarily, because we have to be the best at managing the US. It will take deft diplomacy. The government did that during the, I call it USMACA, NAFTA too, deft diplomacy. There wasn't any, if you attack a populist president, you don't then have the space to get him to do what you want him to do. Diplomacy is the art of letting others have your way. So don't expect that kind of government reckoning that, yeah, we got a serious problem south of the border and we need to really worry about all of these threats to Canada. I don't think that's where they will go, nor should they go. But behind the scenes, thinking needs to be done. And in a way, those of you in academia have much more space to do that heavy lifting as well.
Thank you very much. We've received a lot of questions online, and thank you for sharing these questions to our panelists. We won't have time to go through them all, so apologies for those. But you can, for those that can't ask the question, but you will be able to ask them to future panels throughout the day. I'll entertain James Cox's question. Why do we always talk about what Canada should do without ever defining the political and grand strategic objectives we want to achieve? Why are we sending ships to the Indo-Pacific region? What is the objective? So what basically should be Canada's objective in the Indo-Pacific region? JC.
I think it's a good question on grand strategy. I think the principal objective and what we find in public opinion polls and everything is that Canadians want to be defended here and they want to be protected. And in some respect, that's our main objective. So most of our strategic thinking should go around defending Canadian space, Canadians in Canada, and our territory. And that would mean, in my sense, an oversized maritime force and oversized air force and space force and investing in information domain. And probably you don't need as many tanks as you think you need them. That would be my assumption. Once you have that, then I think the second order question is like, okay, once you've achieved that kind of autonomy and protection of the territory, what do you want to do? And I think what you want to do is somehow invest times with allies, help allies and partners so that you basically, external balance the rest of the world, right? And so provide support when you can to external allies when they need this. That means what? A couple of countries, European countries, France, UK, and invest a lot of time in those relationships, invest times with the Americans, and in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, Australia, and kind of increase these relationships. Why we should be in the Indo-Pacific? Mostly to increase these relationships with allies so that in the times of needs, of Canadian needs, they'll be there for us, hopefully. So that would be my broader strategic sense. Internal balancing the world, increase our domestic defense and be stronger at home, but also external balance, increase our relationships, probably spend less time in multilateral forums, more time in bilateral relationships, and use our military diplomacy as a way to engage and increase those relationships and partnerships. And I think that helps us in the end.
Merci. Roland?
I think, James, it's a terrific question, and it's the kind of question that we should be asking in every aspect of our defense policy or our foreign policy more generally. With regard to, sorry, the question got changed. What is Canada trying to accomplish by having, for example, naval vessels in Indo-Pacific? So I would rank the Canadian interests as follows. First is an economic interest. So our economy, our people will be damaged should there be a dramatic disruption of global trade, which is increasingly centered in the region, number one. Number two, on the economic side, is this region is the fastest growing, most promising area of the world for additional Canadian exports. And if we don't plug in to the region as a whole, I'm not talking about any specific country, but key countries, then our competitors, some of them are allies who are plugging into that part of the world, will benefit from those much higher levels of growth. And already we're in a world of relatively slow growth, and we need to be exploring trade opportunities whenever we can. So there's economic. Secondly, as JC said, allies. We need friends. We will always need friends. And we need to always be thinking about how do we maintain those relationships and how do we contribute in ways that make sense for Canada. It doesn't mean that it's ready, ready, and we'll head off to the Boer War in South Africa without thinking about it. We did not, contribute troops to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. That was the right decision. But we always need to be thinking about where we can be working and helping our allies. Thirdly, I would say that there's a whole set of global public goods, and I would include peace as one of them. And this region has the potential to be, I think, the greatest threat to global stability should certain problems continue to grow. But global public goods, there are a whole bunch of other problems that we can't deal with unless we're cooperating with actors in the region, including, say, climate change. Finally, what Kerry mentioned about voice, Canadian voice. And this is partly important because we want to be able, to the extent that it's possible to do so, to shape outcomes in ways that reflect Canadian interests and Canadian values. But it's also important because we don't want to be just an adjunct to the United States. We've never wanted to be that. And it's partly the idea of, our own sense of having a distinct role and objectives, but it's also that by having voice, we create spaces in which we can have influence, and that is an investment in opportunities to do things with other countries that you never know what might emerge. Anyway, that's how I would break down the answer to James's question.
Thank you.
I had the same answer as Roland, agree entirely. I'll just add a bit on the peace front. Peace is not just a global good. There are direct Canadian security interests potentially at play. What are those direct interests? China has a relatively new Arctic policy, at a minimum has commercial interests, has been mapping part of the Arctic seabed, and is starting to build more infrastructure and working with Russia, who's put in place in their European Arctic about 800 new installations. So Arctic. Disinformation. consistent attacks on Chinese diaspora community Canadians in Canada. That has an impact on Canadian citizens, people living here that we should worry about, and it can have some social cohesion impacts that we should worry about. Disinformation, hostage diplomacy, and disinformation and cyber. Cyber that has been mostly focused on commercial, but not entirely, and a lot of integration of Chinese SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and academic institutions closely affiliated with the Chinese state that are very present in a lot of our academic institutions, our investment. So we need to up our game in understanding security risks that presents, better understanding of the investment risks and the academic risks, particularly in some science areas like space, for instance, or nuclear. So direct security interests that we need to think about. And react to in a very, I think, smart way. And then JC's point, I can tell you those allies are pretty happy when we have frigates operating in the Taiwan Strait, not just because of the people and the kit we bring and the assets, hardware, because of the political benefit. It's not just a bilateral China-Canada thing, right? And nor should it be, because China needs to get the message that there is a broader swath of the world that's very concerned about them being too aggressive. We don't want the Chinese leadership to be given license to do what Putin did in Ukraine over Taiwan. And the way to do that is to send a message about potential deterrence message, which is why we have our frigates in the Taiwan Straits.
Well, I think those words of wisdom are a perfect way to close the panel. I know there are many more questions online, certainly, but we'll benefit from a nice coffee break and many, many muffins for 15 minutes. I hope you enjoy that time.
In 15 minutes, I would welcome the next panel to please come up on the stage. But for now, let's thank our panelists and go to the break. Thank you.